to Current Affairs. My name is Nathan Robinson. I'm the editor-in-chief of Current Affairs magazine, and I am joined today by the magnificent presenter, Jessica Burbank. You can find Jessica Burbank at Jessica L. Burbank on Twitter. Jessica does many, many things. She has hosted The Hill Rising. She hosts the Funny Money podcast. You can find her where she's hugely successful on TikTok, and she is now the host of the new YouTube news program, The Weekly-ish News. Jessica Burbank, welcome to Current Affairs.
It's so good to be on. I'm a fan of Current Affairs. I'm in a weird mindset because I just found out that Nathan doesn't wear bow ties.
I can say, yeah, no, this is good. I'm glad we have the opportunity to clear this up, because a lot of people believe this. You believed it.
Yes.
Many of our listeners might believe that I wear bow ties.
I came on, I saw that Nathan wasn't wearing a bow tie, and I said, oh, it's so interesting to see you not in a bow tie.
And that's my natural condition. I don't even own a bow tie. People won't believe this, but you can go back and you can look at every picture of me you've ever seen, every video you've ever seen, and you will not find one of me in a bow tie. Just clearing that up. Thank you, Jessica.
I'll just be getting over this on my own time.
I want to talk to you about all the things you do, Jessica Burbank, because we admire you here at Current Affairs. Before we get to the weekly-ish news, I want to talk about your TikTok presence, because you are phenomenally successful on TikTok, and there is a particular type of Jessica Burbank video on TikTok in which multiple versions of yourself talk to one another, and you've become quite well known for these. Perhaps you could describe, for those who are unfamiliar with what the typical Jessica Burbank TikTok video is.
Yes, it's true. It's not any sort of personality disorder. I don't have multiple personalities. They're all me, and now it's acting. And I very much enjoy being both sides of the conversation, because that's how all the right questions get asked. But it's a good way when you're talking about politics. Inevitably, you're going to say something that doesn't line up with the audience, even if their views tend towards yours. And having it be a conversational piece allows you to say, okay, this is a common misconception. This is something that someone might believe that I know is not true, but not many people might not know is true. Let's debunk the assumptions and the thoughts to the contrary that will inevitably pop up before they have a chance to think of them themselves. And so it allows it to be a persuasive piece, even though it doesn't feel like that.
That's very interesting, and I want to get more specific on what you mean by that. So, for example, a couple of the videos that come to mind as you describe this is you have one in which you are playing, I think, someone who's built a business versus someone who is basically yourself, a leftist, and the business owner is talking about how they built it, they did the work, they should get the credit. You also have one that I just watched a few minutes ago, rewatched, which is one where you're talking to an Elon Musk fan who has a portrait of Elon Musk behind them, who's describing how wonderful he is. And what's interesting about what you just said to me is that you try and make the other point of view almost persuasive. The character that you make is like articulating the most compelling possible version of that position in a certain way.
Right. Yeah. I don't want it to be a straw man that I'm arguing against, because I think people would easily point that out and be like, well, this is so easy. Of course, you can debunk that point. And I think also it comes from my experience as an organizer, just talking to everyday people. I go into every conversation with someone politically with this fundamental belief that no one's wrong for their views. And our views come from our limited experience, and American media is so full of propaganda that it's no fault of their own that they've consumed propaganda and haven't seen the other side. And so sure, it could be a reasonable position given someone's life experiences and all of the media they've ever consumed and information they've had access to because they're a victim of the American public school system. It's no fault to their own that they might be an Elon Musk stan and think we have a meritocracy and that all billionaires are absolute geniuses. I can understand why someone would grow up thinking that in this country. So I don't want to make the other person look stupid. I want them to seem reasonable.
Well, and they're played by you, so they are like, it's interesting. They're almost likable characters in a certain way, And yeah, and as I say, when you're playing the business owner, you're really inhabiting what that person would be like and what obviously you parody them a bit, you exaggerate a bit, but yeah, so tell us a little more about, maybe you could give people an example of how you've constructed one of these dialogues in a way that in a short amount of time, you can take a position that is commonly held and challenge it through this like Socratic dialogue process.
Yeah, it does sound like a philosophical exercise, the way you put it, that I put myself really into the shoes of the person that holds these views that are very different from my own views. And I think it's helped me consider, my beliefs from a bunch of different perspectives and test them and come up with more persuasive explanations for things that I already talk about on a regular basis. And so doing the back and forth, it actually ended up being so much faster than if it was just me talking at the camera, like writing out what I'm trying to explain. It's actually easier to explain certain things with the back and forth. And like that factory worker conversation, it's a lot easier to get the point across when you also have the visual of like, here's the boss, here's the worker, here's what this would look like. And so it's so much easier to convey what this is like, that there's just this boss walking around overseeing all of the workers not doing work themselves and getting all of the profit. Just seeing the person having a casual conversation while the other person's supposedly working does a lot on its own. So sometimes I will write a script and be like, actually, I don't even need to have this part of the dialogue. It's not necessary, because that's just obvious because of how this back and forth is happening. So it's been really interesting that it started off because there are all of these silly skits I was seeing on TikTok of the back and forth conversation. And I made the first one talking about the deficit and how there's all these misconceptions about it. And I actually did a terrible job with the first skit, even though it got a lot of views. It had the impact of like Colbert Report satire, where people thought that the person that was the reasonable one was the person saying the government spent too much money and the deficit's a huge problem. And so I actually didn't do a good job being persuasive in that video, because people left it thinking, well, of course, that was the reasonable one.
Well, you did too good of a job presenting the bad position.
Right. And so I've had to learn how to avoid that.
Tell us, like, if you take, I can't remember exactly how these dialogues go, but if you could give us a preview of sort of how, because you're doing this in quite a short amount of time. I mean, you're really trying to boil down, like, when you're doing the owner and the worker, I mean, you're trying to explain class relations in, I don't know how long that video is, but it is not long to get across the basic Marxist theory of exploitation.
Yes, and a big problem with this, the reason I have such limited time, is because of exploitation itself. People have such short attention spans. They're trying to maximize their leisure time by consuming as much entertainment and content as possible. It's almost like, because people are swiping so fast, your amount of time to explain to them, like anything, politics, news, your idea, your perspective, is so small. And so you almost have to do it in a way that's concise and entertaining. Otherwise, you're just not going to be heard. And so the way it would go, if I were to explain freeloaders, for example, I just did a video on that. If I were to say, many people think that the working class in America is freeloading because there are welfare programs where people receive food assistance or housing assistance. But, really, we've seen corporate profits on the rise and XYZ. It would take a long time, many more words, than if I just had one person who's just hanging out in what looks like a living room green screen behind me, of like a middle-aged family who's watching Fox News, and they say, I'm sick of all the freeloaders taking our tax dollars. And it's like, well, what do you mean? And then they say, well, Walmart and McDonald's actually have a ton of employees that are on food assistance and on Medicare. And it's like, what? No, the freeloaders are actually the people that are on welfare. And it's like, well, no, those people are working full time. You really cut to just the substance of the conversation without the explanatory language that would have to come around it if you were just lecturing at someone.
Because I've realized over time, Jessica Burbank, that your videos are deceptively simple in a certain way, because, you look at on the surface, as you say, there's sometimes it's you in a hat. The production values are not, expensive or high end here. But there's an incredible art. There's a lot of work that goes into thinking about how you convey left ideas persuasively. These are things that people might not have, as you say, you're trying to convince people. You're trying to take things that they might not believe and challenge their pre-existing conceptions in a very short amount of time and the raw materials that you have to do it with are like you without a hat and you in a hat. And there's a real art to doing that successfully.
It's like that old Mark Twain quote where he says, I didn't have time to write a short letter, so I wrote a long one. That it actually takes a lot of time to make these skits like very concise and convey kind of complicated ideas in a way that is simple and seems common sense. And I think to the credit of just the right in America, the neoliberals, the duopoly, mainstream opinions, they explain things that are so perversely wrong as if they are common sense and true. And we've almost, as leftists, been put in this position of having to explain how all of that is wrong, and also this other thing you've never heard of that sounds converse to everything you've heard is true. And so by avoiding that conversation altogether and just saying, well, what if I explain this position as if it were common sense, as if it were assumed, as if it were true, that's really powerful. To not confront the misconceptions as if they are the dominant narrative, to not take the dominant narrative for granted and just say, well, this is how it is based on our human lived experiences and data we have. If you put those two things together, I think you have a more powerful narrative than the status quo.
Because I agree with you. I'm always almost in awe of the right as communicators. I review a lot of right-wing books, and they're always very accessible. They always, they're written in pretty simple, compelling language. Right-wing pundits are often, they're clear. Like what Fox News does is evil. But my God, as a piece of propaganda, you almost have to, it's a craft. You almost have to admire the craft of the propaganda, even as it's morally heinous. And so I think a lot about, as you say, we have these ideas that are often very complicated and difficult. They take a while. It takes a lot longer an order of magnitude more time to refute a piece of bullshit than to spew it. And so figuring out, I think constantly, how on earth do we communicate with people? And you do it in this fascinating way where you're doing like skits to convey very serious ideas. I mean, you're talking about, as you say, the first one's about the deficit, for God's sakes.
Yeah, they are very serious. I don't take myself terribly seriously in my day-to-day life. And so injecting a bit of comedy into it is something that I don't have to think about very much. I'm like, all right, this is not me being genuine if I'm not making it a little bit sarcastic. And I think that lands with people as well. I think people are kind of sick of political debates being overwhelmingly academic, intellectual sounding, that there needs to be such a clear right and wrong instead of just like, hey, we're all people. What's the best stuff to do for the people? And there's all kinds of criticisms about that way of thinking, that it's populist and populism is dangerous. And I find that conversation interesting because like right-wing populism, yes, it's dangerous, but like left-wing populism is very cool in my eyes, and making people embrace populism because they're kind of ripe for it. They don't like the elites. They don't like the way they communicate. And so I think another thing is just people are ready for it. And I think we have this opportunity where it's like, yeah, people are gravitating towards populism. And we can either put the ideas out there and say like, hey, how about we make a government and economy that works for everyone, instead of having this brand of populism that's very fearful, can be very racist. So I think like presenting the alternative online is important because the right has so much money to make good propaganda that I kind of see it as a way of organizing, making propaganda on the other side.
No, I agree. I mean, I think you, Jessica Burbank, are one of the left's great communicators, and people might not realize this because you're making TikTok videos where you're wearing hats. But I look at your TikTok account and I think we have this. It's also when you think about the platforms that we have to work with, right? I write 10,000 word articles sometimes, and it's like, okay, but a lot of people aren't reading 10,000 word articles, and we have to like use the tools and the platforms that everyone is on. Take this as a given. Take as a given the fact that everyone is watching short videos of things and they're just getting fed all these short. What do you do with that medium? And you seem to have cracked the code here.
Yeah, I love this little book. It's a tiny book that you'll find in organizing circles, people who are labor organizers who knock doors and stuff. It's by Fred Ross Jr. It's called Axioms of Organizing. And there are quite a few of them that talk about just meeting people where they're at. And there's a beautiful story people tell about him knocking doors and just finding the most brilliant organizers that have ever organized through maybe calling it a day and deciding to knock one more door. And then it's Cesar Chavez or whatever, which is a true story that he brought him into the fold of organizing by just knocking his door one day. But meeting people where they're at right now, I don't think is knocking their door, because when someone comes to your door, you just want to get back and rest and scroll on TikTok again. You're not really meeting someone where they're at, because they're absent-minded when they answer the door. They're like, how can I get back to my television? How can I get back to my leisure time where I'm consuming entertainment? And so meeting people where they're at, like if I put my organizer cap on, it is scrolling TikTok. That is where they're getting information. And I have the same lizard brain as well, like diagnosed with ADHD. I take medication for it. I get why people don't want to sit down and read the 10,000 word article, even though I went to graduate school and had to read research papers. Like, I get why people don't want to do that, and they want it to be entertaining. And so a big part of it is meeting people where they're at. And I found that actually on the left, especially in like big organizing nonprofit spaces, a lot of people don't want to invest in social media. They like really don't see getting on there and making videos as a reasonable thing to invest in. And I left like a huge nonprofit, People's Action, which was founded coming out of the labor movement. And they have like member organizations in every state. And just, I felt like if I was on the phones all day, or if I was creating a list for a mass text, we were engaging people less than my posts on TikTok. And so when I left to pursue media, I actually didn't feel like I was leaving organizing. I felt like I was going to the heart of it.
You're listening to the Current Affairs podcast from Current Affairs magazine in New Orleans, Louisiana. Current Affairs is a registered 501c3 nonprofit organization, and we depend entirely on reader subscriptions and donations. You'll notice we have no ads, no mattresses, no recruiters, no sports betting. If you can help us in our mission to build independent progressive media, please visit currentaffairs.org/donate to make a donation, or currentaffairs.org/subscribe to subscribe to our beautiful print magazine. Thank you so much for supporting our work. Now, back to the program.
No, I agree with, I mean, this is why I'm in media, right? I mean, because I just think like this is shaping people's ideas, right? You know, the ideas that people get are often the things that they've heard and been exposed to. And if we're not in the territory, if we cede the territory, there are people with horrible, horrible ideas who are going to find compelling ways to present those ideas.
Right. That's so true. And I was one of those people that grew up working class and spent a lot of time with my mom, who was always taught, pull yourself up by your bootstraps and you'll be fine. And if you work hard, you'll do well in America, right? Classic American dream, bootstraps conservatism. And I slowly found out that how I viewed the world in that way didn't match up with how the system was designed. And so I was one of those people that was really like, oh, like, we don't need welfare programs. Like, people should just work. And so because I was in that mindset, due to mostly, you know, my lack of understanding of the world, I can understand why people are in that position. And I think like some of the best communicators of like leftism are the former conservatives.
Yeah, because they understand the sorts of things that you have to say and won't be persuasive and what will. Well, in that case, let me ask you, Jessica, given that, you know, you became a leftist, how did you become a leftist, and how does your own process of becoming a leftist, what insights does that give us into how we can take other people who might be like your former self and turn them into your current self?
I was a leftist before I knew I was a leftist. I always said that I hated politics. I didn't want any part of it, didn't like elections, thought America was hopeless and dysfunctional. And I had this professor. I got really lucky to go to college. I was in trade school. I didn't think I would end up going, and became the first in my family to do so. And then I was almost going to have to drop out because Pell Grants are inconsistent. You like get them and they dry up, and then you have to figure out where that money comes from like the next year. And so I ended up taking the first semester of my sophomore year off. But the professor that I had during my freshman year, my first year there, was Tukumbi Lumumba Kasongo. And he's the nephew of Patrice Lumumba, who was the leader of the Democratic Republic of Congo, who freed the slaves, fought colonial rule from Belgium, and the CIA assassinated him. And there's documents now making it very clear that that was their goal. They sent people off to do that. And for a long time, it was the case that people denied it was the CIA, but it really was. And so his nephew was just teaching at this tiny college in upstate New York. And I thought he was brilliant, and I studied really hard in his classes. And so when I took the semester off, he sent me an email. And he was like, why aren't you in school? And I said, we're struggling to afford it. I'm working as a waitress right now. And he said, well, if you come back, I'll make you my teaching assistant. And so because of him, I finished school, and because of the way he communicates and his ideas is why I'm a leftist, because he talks about the world in the way I described earlier, just what's good for human beings. And you can imagine he probably has a lot of disdain for American imperialism, given that his close family member was killed by the CIA. But he has no bitterness in communicating what's wrong with imperialism. And I thought that it was really brilliant. And because his first language is not English, he speaks with a heavy accent, but speaks in very simple words. So I learned all of these concepts of political science and international studies and public policy from someone who was communicating the ideas to me in very simple words. So because I first learned them that way, they're kind of ingrained to me in that way. So I think he really shaped my brain politically, but also made me a better communicator as well, just because of who he is and how he speaks.
Let me ask you, do you have any favorites among your own videos that you've produced, or things that you think worked particularly well in communicating an idea in a narrow space?
It's a good idea, or a good question. I think the factory video is one of my favorites ever.
Yeah, it's very good.
Yeah, I love that one. And then there was a video I put out after a jobs report came out as well, talking about intentional unemployment. And I thought that one was quite good too. It is one of the biggest crises of our times that we have intentional unemployment, that the Federal Reserve thinks interest rates need to be at X level and this population of people needs to be unemployed, or else inflation will be a problem. It's just an absurd thing to assume. And instead of going into the details of economic policy and how this doesn't shake out and going in the macroeconomics textbook, it's just with basic logic, how do we debunk this? And so that's, I think, really powerful, that you don't need to be an economist to understand that this is broken. So of course you can make a video explaining to everyone how their logic collapses in itself when you even use simple concepts of supply and demand. If more people are working, they're producing more, there's more stuff to buy. It's not a situation where too many dollars are chasing too few goods. Inflation's not a concern because things are in balance then. And so I think videos like that are really just relevant, jobs report comes out, everyone's thinking about inflation, let's make a video on this, but let's not make it super technical.
Yeah. It's really impressive. And I encourage our listeners to go through your archive, because I really do think that there's lessons in political communication there that are just not unnecessarily obvious on first viewing. I mean, people might see you you do videos where you're translating the news into Star Wars when you're doing with the Princess Leia hair. And it's people might not see the deeply, deeply morally serious underpinning to everything you're doing. And so I want them to watch them understanding the organizing mentality at the base of the Jessica Burbank political project. Let's talk about your new venture, Weekly-ish News on YouTube. Tell us more about this.
This is exciting. This is it's not so much the Daily Show or Jon Stewart. It's not serious. This is just what's happening, and here's what I think about it, and here's what I'm passionate about, the Candace Owens, Ben Shapiro type way of doing news commentary and news coverage. It's more like Jon Stewart in the sense that it's not serious, but I can't help but have it be educational. I just have a natural inclination towards, okay, well, what's the relevant information needed to understand what's going on? Not just here's the news, but what do people need to know to understand the news that they might not be getting on mainstream TV? So that's the show. And I think it was kind of coming out of me doing the TikToks led to me getting recruited to do commentary on TYT. And I never thought of doing something like that before. So I was kind of thrust into the world of political commentary and news, not knowing what it was. And I quickly was like, okay, this kind of doing it, and this kind of commentary probably isn't relevant for young people or the working class, and just slowly through doing it and seeing how it was done at TYT and all of the other shows that are out there, I was kind of like, we need something that's a little bit deeper, that has a little bit more thought put into it in terms of research, and like really producing something that allows people to understand the concepts and understand a framework of thinking so that they can apply it themselves, like give people the tools they need to break down propaganda and understand this the next time it comes up in the news cycle. Like Stephen Kinzer, who writes a lot about American intervention, was a mentor to me when I was in graduate school. And he said, after he became more of a history writer, he was a foreign correspondent for the Times and found out the Times was pretty much a parrot for American imperialism. He said, the news is what's happening right now, but what's really important is what happened yesterday and what's likely to happen tomorrow. And so I wanted to really do a show that covers that.
So tell us, when people watch this, what is the sort of thing that they can expect to see? How do you go about covering an issue on this new show?
Yeah, here's the facts of what's happening, the facts of the story. So recently I did a segment on Fox News covering the Harvard professor's study where he said there's no racial bias in police shootings. And I did program analysis and studied public policy research. So I was like, let's read this study and really see if he can confidently say there's no racial bias in police shootings. And I was just kind of appalled that he was confident in letting that headline run, that that's what he found, and saying that was the finding. After reading the study, he just really didn't have enough data and evidence there. And I was like, why is Fox reporting on this again? And it turns out he's like doing interviews saying how terrible it was that he had to get private security and he had a newborn baby and people were so violent just because what he put out didn't match up their idea of the world. So what I did is I said, here's what Fox is saying. Here's what's in the study that's wrong. And here's how it fits into the larger narrative of policing, that actually police comes from slave patrol, and to make this assumption that there's no racial bias in police shootings, because what he looked at is if an interaction's happening, is he likely, or is the police officer in the interaction likely to shoot the subject if they're white, Hispanic, or Black? And he ignored the fact that the police were interacting with more Black people than anyone else, 4 times their proportion of the population. And so if of course there's racial bias in police shootings. If someone walks out of the door in the morning and they're Black, they're way more likely to be shot by police unless they're white. But because he made it so precise, it became such a part of the conservative narrative about police shootings, and they clung to this, and they use this in arguments all of the time.
So they love the Roland Fryer study. It's in the Wall Street Journal all the time. They love this one study.
They always go back to it, and it's based on nothing at all, really. And he actually wrote a follow-up paper where he said these other papers published by Vice, The Guardian, and the Post were more robust. They had better data than I had. But he won't say that when he's doing his interviews. But he did say it in the paper where he walked things back 3 years later.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting, though, because you're training people, you're taking a news thing, a thing that is said in Fox, and you are doing a few things there, which is first, you're discussing why are they talking about this? You're also saying, okay, you're kind of training. I think it's so important to train people in critical thinking, which is, okay, let's look at the study and let's think about where the study goes wrong. Okay, well, what are the other ways in which racial bias, okay, it may be true that given a particular interaction, there's no difference in the chance that someone will be shot based on their race. But what determines the different interactions? That's the important question. And if there's more policing of one neighborhood than another, right? So you're training them to think critical about the evidence, and then, as you say, you're also giving them crucial historical context to understand, why all of this came about. And you're doing it all in 10 minutes.
So it has to be fast. It has to be entertaining. I do all of the editing myself, which is a lot of work, but it's very rewarding coming out of it and saying, this is communicated in exactly the way I think people will understand and enjoy it.
You deserve an editor, Jessica. We need to get you an editor.
I do. Yes. Yeah. I appreciate that you point out that it's like you see me and you see the Star Wars and the silly hats, but it's actually thinking about this stuff all the time. It's quite dark. The news is very dark, but someone's got to do it.
Yeah. No, it's true. I mean, I wanted to talk to you in part because I really do feel like we pursue a common project in two quite different ways. You know,
Right.
our print magazine is full of silly stuff, right? It's full of fake ads for non-existent satirical products. And you can pick it up and you can flick through it and you can think we're just being goofy. But the writing of those is like, there's like an underlying, like, we're trying to show you something about the world. We're trying to train you on how to see, how to look at how to look at the messages. Like, by parodying a magazine, we're like trying to teach you how these things work. And I feel like, you know, when people start doing close reads of your videos, they're going to get the same kind of understanding.
I think people absorb a lot more value and information through comedy than anything else. Yeah. I think it's such an important tool. Like, if you really care about your idea getting communicated, like, can you make it funny? Yeah. Great. Then you have a brilliant idea.
Well, we really wish you the best for Weekly-ish News. I really do hope this takes off, because I think that, you know, and I encourage all of our listeners and readers to check it out and to follow you, because I mean, I do just think that what you're doing here is so important. What is your ultimate ambition? What do you want this to become? If it succeeds to the degree that you're trying to get it to see, you know, what is the core of what you're trying to make here?
That I just get to keep doing it. Yeah. That I have an editor, so I'm not spending 10 hours of my life. Yeah, that can just edit it the same way that I would edit it. But yeah, that it can come out on a weekly-ish basis. Because sometimes I think when I was doing the biggest news of the week on TikTok, I would try and force topics that I didn't think were really the biggest news. So now I get to say, okay, there's enough to talk about. I can record it. And I think just doing it on a regular basis as a supplement to news, right? People should be checking news probably more frequently than I put content out. It's okay if they don't. Everyone's busy. But yeah, just doing it on a regular basis. And many people watch it, and they're mostly young people and working class people. Yeah. Or people who would not consume any news if it didn't exist. Like, I would love to reach those people with it.
Well, I think we can say for certain that people will become more intelligent and informed if they watch the Weekly-ish News with Jessica Burbank. Jessica Burbank, thank you so much for joining us on Current Affairs today.
Thank you for having me. It's been great chatting with you. You have such good energy, and I promise everyone there's no bow tie.
It's the giant cat of red that fuels the interviews. No, I like to come out with some enthusiasm, but I have a special enthusiasm for speaking to you, because I have wanted to for a couple of years now, because I see your stuff all the time, and I just think it's so good.
Thank you. That's so kind.
And people can find you, as I say, on YouTube with the Weekly-ish News, and Jessica L. Burbank on Twitter.
The Current Affairs Podcast is a product of Current Affairs Magazine. If you are not subscribed to Current Affairs Magazine, visit currentaffairs.org/subscribe today and get our glorious print edition. The Current Affairs Podcast is released regularly every week on patreon.com/currentaffairs. Thanks for listening.